spring of 1947, the vast boat-building plant in Marysville, Michigan, went entirely quiet. Outside its doors, the United States was entering the largest recreational maritime boom in human history. Millions of Americans had returned from the war with money, time, and a fierce hunger for the water. Dealerships across the country were overwhelmed. Marinas were expanding overnight. At the exact moment the market exploded, the Gar Wood production lines halted. The workers laid down their tools. The remaining stock of imported mahogany sat untouched in the sheds. Without warning, the company simply stopped building pleasure boats forever. The decision defied commercial logic. A decade earlier, that same brand held undisputed supremacy over American water. From the deep blue stretches of Lake Tahoe to the elite yacht clubs of Long Island Sound, the name Gar Wood meant absolute power. It was the varnished runabout that Wall Street bankers and industrial barons demanded. If a hull carried the Gar Wood stamp, it commanded the highest price, the best slips, and the deepest respect from every marine mechanic from Miami to Newport. They had the reputation, they had the legacy, they had buyers standing by with cash. But the real story of Gar Wood Boats in America is not a sudden factory closure at the dawn of the post-war era. It is the story of an obsession with perfection colliding with the brutal realities of mass commerce. It is the story of ultimate craftsmanship versus standardized economics, of hand-varnished wood versus a new age of low-maintenance leisure, and of what happens when a maritime empire discovers its masterworks are too uncompromising to survive in a country that had decided to optimize the weekend. Somewhere in a marina, in a museum, in a boatyard, or in a quiet shipyard office, there is a builder's plate with a name and an American story behind it. We tell those stories. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins not on the glitzy shores of the French Riviera, but deep in the American industrial heartland, in Detroit, Michigan, in 1922. Before the spring of 1922, American waterways were largely divided into two distinct worlds. There was the working water, dominated by steam tugs, steel barges, and coastal freighters moving the industrial weight of a growing nation. And there was the leisure water, defined by heavy displacement yachts, slow naphtha launches, and sailing craft that relied on the patience of the wind. Speed on the water existed, but it was confined to the grimy, specialized realm of professional racers. If a Wall Street banker, an automotive executive, or a steel magnate wanted to travel across Long Island Sound or Lake George at 40 miles per hour, he could not simply buy a boat to do it. He had to commission a custom naval architect, hire a dedicated mechanic, and pray the experimental engine did not catch fire. High-speed leisure did not exist as a commercial product. The American market lacked a vessel that could deliver brutal mechanical power wrapped in absolute luxury. In Detroit, Michigan, Garfield Arthur Wood understood that absence better than any man in the country. Wood had already built a vast industrial fortune inventing the hydraulic dump truck hoist. He poured that wealth into a relentless, dangerous pursuit of waterborne speed. His custom-built Miss America hydroplanes dominated international racing, bringing the Harmsworth Trophy to the United States and turning Wood into a national celebrity. But Wood realized that his racing technology could be standardized. He envisioned a boat that a wealthy amateur could steer with a simple automotive wheel, a vessel that required no racing helmet, yet could outrun anything else on the lake. In 1922, he formed Gar Wood Boats. He did not build his factory in a traditional coastal shipbuilding town like Bath, Maine, or Newport, Rhode Island. He built it in Algonac, Michigan, drawing on the deep pool of automotive engineering talent, specialized metalworkers, and precision craftsmen that the Detroit car industry had created. To power his vision, Wood turned to the surplus of the First World War. The United States government had stockpiled thousands of Liberty L-12 aircraft engines, massive 400 horsepower V-12 power plants originally designed for heavy bombers. Wood purchased these 1,049 cubic inch engines in massive quantities at scrap prices. He brought them to his Michigan factory and marinized them. Marinization, the process of adapting an engine built for the air or land to survive the corrosive, enclosed, and cooling restricted environment of a boat bilge. Wood's engineers modified the carburetors, engineered massive water cooling jackets, and fitted them to heavy-duty direct drive transmissions. He dropped these terrifying engines into a beautifully proportioned 33-foot wooden hull. It was constructed of solid Philippine mahogany. Mahogany, a dense, rot-resistant tropical hardwood that, when sanded and sealed with multiple coats of marine varnish, produced a mirror-like finish of deep red and gold. Wood called this creation the Baby Gar. The American entry of the Baby Gar was a calculated assault on the centers of old wealth. To sell a boat of this magnitude, Wood needed a distribution channel that understood his target demographic. In 1923, he partnered with Howard W. Lyon, a sophisticated marine dealer. Lyon did not open a dusty boatyard on the edge of town. He opened a showroom inside the luxurious Hotel Barclay on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan, New York. It was here, surrounded by marble floors and crystal chandeliers, that the American industrial elite first encountered the Baby Gar. The sheer audacity of placing a 33-foot V12-powered mahogany speedboat inside a Midtown Manhattan hotel shattered the traditional boundaries of maritime retail. The price was equally staggering. In 1924, a fully equipped 33-foot Baby Gar runabout carried a retail price of approximately $9,800. In today's currency, that is roughly $175,000. It was the price of a substantial waterfront estate in many coastal markets. But for that sum, an owner was purchasing a guarantee of absolute supremacy. The boat could achieve 50 miles per hour. In the 1920s, most roads could not safely support an automobile traveling at that speed, let alone a boat pounding across the unpredictable chop of a bay. The American maritime press recognized the paradigm shift immediately. In the spring of 1924, Motor Boating magazine published a detailed review of the Baby Gar. The editors marveled not just at the straight-line speed, but at the engineering of the hull form itself, noting its uncanny ability to bank into high-speed turns without bearing the bow. It was a level of seakeeping, the measure of a vessel's safety and stability in dynamic water conditions, that earlier large speedboats had never achieved. The response from the American elite was decisive. By 1927, Howard W. Lyon had sold over 50 of these 33-foot Leviathans directly to the titans of American industry. Names like Vanderbilt, Wrigley, and Dodge appeared on the order books. The Baby Gar became a fixture at the New York Yacht Club stations, roaring past the slow, majestic sailing yachts of the previous generation. The American market had found its new apex. A Gar Wood boat was no longer just a vessel. It was a mechanical statement of arrival. The boats demanded meticulous care. They required high-octane aviation fuel, specialized mechanics who understood aircraft magnetos, and endless hours of hand-applied varnish to protect the mahogany from the blistering summer sun. In the roaring economy of the 1920s, these maintenance burdens were not considered flaws. They were simply the accepted price of admission. But the reliance on complex mechanics and uncompromising, labor-intensive finish had established a standard that the company would soon have to defend against a rapidly changing country. By the late 1920s, the initial shock of the massive 33-foot Baby Gar had proven a concept, but Garfield Wood knew that selling a handful of custom Leviathans to New York aristocrats could not sustain a manufacturing empire. To conquer the broader American waterways, the Algonac factory needed a standardized fleet. They needed vessels that retained the uncompromising quality of a custom yacht, but could fit inside a standard boathouse, be handled by an owner without a hired mechanic, and be distributed through a national dealer network. The breakthrough arrived when Gar Wood introduced a complete line of shorter, refined runabouts, ranging from 22 to 28 feet. Stepping aboard a 28-foot Gar Wood runabout in 1930 was an overwhelming sensory experience. The boat smelled of raw gasoline, hot oil, and fresh spar varnish. The layout featured a triple cockpit design, dividing passengers into deep, leather-upholstered seating areas separated by gleaming wooden decks. The driver sat behind a massive automotive-style steering wheel, watching a dashboard of silver-rimmed gauges that tracked oil pressure, water temperature, and engine RPM. But the true engineering marvel was hidden beneath the waterline. The boats utilized a highly refined planing hull, a hull designed to rise and skim across the water at speed, reducing drag and allowing faster operation. Wood's engineers perfected the chine, the sharp edge where the bottom of the hull meets the side. A properly designed chine deflects spray away from the passengers and provides immense lateral stability, allowing the boat to carve through tight turns at 40 miles per hour without rolling over. Powering these hulls was a direct drive inboard, a propulsion system where the engine connects straight to a propeller shaft, piercing the bottom of the boat, delivering immediate, unfiltered torque. Instead of surplus aircraft engines, Gar Wood turned to modern, reliable marine power plants built by Scripps and Chrysler Marine. At the dock, the massive six-cylinder and eight-cylinder engines idled with a deep, rhythmic rumble that resonated through the wooden frames. On the open water, when the heavy brass throttle lever was pushed forward, the bow rose toward the sky, the hull broke free of its own wave, and the vessel flattened out into a sustained, violent glide. The price of this experience was deliberately exclusionary. In 1930, a 28-foot Gar Wood runabout sold for roughly $4,500. In modern currency, that is approximately $85,000. It was not the most expensive object a wealthy family could buy, but in a maritime market where a comparable 28-foot Chris craft could be purchased for $1,000 less, the Gar Wood demanded a premium. The financial commitment did not end at the dealership. Fuel was cheap, but maintenance was relentless. The hull required an annual haul-out, the process of lifting a boat out of the water for maintenance or inspection. The seams had to be caulked. The mahogany required continuous sanding and revarnishing to survive the ultraviolet degradation of the American summer. The engine required precise mechanical tuning, yet buyers paid the premium because of the American moat Gar Wood had built: structural invincibility. In rough water, a cheaper boat would flex, squeak, and eventually leak. A Gar Wood did not. The Algonac factory used a heavier keel, the central structural backbone along the bottom of a vessel that helps provide strength. They framed the boats with dense white oak. They planked the bottoms with a double layer of Philippine mahogany, interleaved with a layer of heavy canvas soaked in marine glue, all fastened together with thousands of solid brass screws. The result was a hull that felt like a solid piece of carved timber, capable of absorbing the punishing chop of an inland lake without transmitting the shock to the passengers. The commercial dam broke at the 1930 National Motorboat Show at the Grand Central Palace in New York City. Despite the devastating stock market crash that had occurred just months prior, Gar Wood displayed a stunning lineup of standardized models. The visual impact of a dozen perfectly varnished hulls under the exhibition lights, combined with Garfield Wood's legendary racing pedigree, convinced the American marine industry that this was the definitive luxury standard. Orders flowed in from the most prestigious maritime environments in the country. The boats were immediately adopted by Obexer's Boat Company on the high-altitude waters of Lake Tahoe, where the dry air and deep water demanded powerful engines and flawless hulls. They were championed by Fitzgerald and Lee in Alexandria Bay, serving the wealthy enclave of the Thousand Islands. The Detroit Yacht Club filled its slips with the hometown brand. Dealers on Worth Avenue and Palm Beach sold them to executives wintering in Florida, while the Seattle Yacht Club welcomed them to the cold, dark waters of the Pacific Northwest. In a remarkably short period, the company expanded its dealer network to over 100 locations nationwide, offering over 20 distinct models. By the mid-1930s, Gar Wood Boats had established a truth that the rest of the American boating industry was forced to accept. A competitor might build a boat that was cheaper, a competitor might build a boat that was lighter, but if an American buyer wanted to cross a rough bay without lifting the throttle, while sitting behind a windshield surrounded by perfect mahogany, there was only one choice. The name on the builder's plate was not a country of origin. It was a specification. By 1938, the American waterways had surrendered to the Algonac factory. Gar Wood Boats had expanded from a boutique builder of racing derivatives into a manufacturing titan occupying 12 acres of riverfront in Michigan. They were no longer simply selling mahogany speedboats. They were supplying the architecture of American aquatic leisure. To understand the scale of this maritime empire, one must look at the specific docks that demanded their presence. The Indian Harbor Yacht Club in Connecticut used them as high-speed tenders. The elite enclaves of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, treated them as essential summer transport. On Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota, local dealerships maintained massive indoor storage facilities exclusively for the brand. In the Thousand Islands, wealthy families commissioned custom boathouses built specifically to match the exact dimensions of a 28-foot Gar Wood runabout. From the municipal marinas of Miami to the prestigious slips of the New York Yacht Club and across the high-altitude waters of Lake Tahoe, where Obexer's boat company tuned carburetors for the thin mountain air, the network was absolute. Miami wanted the offshore capability. Lake Tahoe wanted the altitude-tuned power. Newport wanted the flawless finish. The product catalog expanded to over 60 distinct models. The company built sedans with fixed wooden roofs for the unpredictable weather of the Pacific Northwest. They built open utility boats, vessels with an open interior layout designed for moving gear and fishing, rather than formal passenger seating, for the Gulf Coast. They built massive twin-engine commuters for Wall Street executives traversing Long Island Sound. At its height before the war, the authorized dealer network expanded to over 120 locations across the United States. By the late 1930s, industry estimates suggest Garwood was producing roughly 1,000 premium boats annually. While their primary domestic rival, Chris Craft, produced vessels in far greater numbers using assembly line efficiencies, Garwood deliberately maintained a slower, costlier pace. Every frame was bolted rather than merely screwed. Every plank was hand-fitted. The factory utilized double-planked bottoms, a construction method where two layers of mahogany were laid over each other with heavy canvas set in marine glue between them, ensuring a completely watertight and incredibly rigid barrier against the sea. In a market where a fractured propeller, a flooded ignition system, or a rotting plank could ruin an entire summer season, this network was not just branding, it was an infrastructure of trust. The owner, the mechanic, and the marina all depended on the same parts supply. A Gar Wood franchise was a highly coveted asset, provided the marina had the specialized mechanics required to maintain the complex marine propulsion systems. The Algonac factory employed hundreds of highly specialized woodworkers, finishers, riggers, and engine mechanics. They operated in an era where skilled labor was affordable, raw Philippine mahogany was abundant, and wealthy buyers were entirely willing to pay for the hundreds of manual hours required to construct, sand, seal, and varnish a single wooden hull. At its peak, encountering a Gar Wood runabout in an American marina was a defining physical experience. Under the intense July sun of a Midwestern lake, the boat did not just float, it commanded the water. The hull was finished with up to 15 coats of hand-brushed marine spar varnish, creating a deep, translucent amber shell that made the heavy mahogany grain appear three-dimensional. The deck hardware was not mass-produced pot metal. It was heavy sand-cast bronze, heavily plated in chrome that reflected the rippling water. When the mechanic turned the heavy ignition key, the starter whined, the massive Chrysler Marine engine caught, and a deep, wet exhaust note bubbled up from beneath the transom. The smell of rich, unburned gasoline and hot varnish drifted across the wooden dock. The shipyard workers stopped what they were doing. The yacht club guests turned to look. The competitors felt the wake. It was a business model built on the absolute assumption that this specific kind of American craftsmanship and the cheap maintenance labor required to sustain it would last forever. The defining American cultural moment for Gar Wood Boats did not happen on a racecourse. It happened in the daily high-stakes theater of wealthy American leisure in the late 1930s. During the final years of the Great Depression, the country was fundamentally divided. But for the industrialists, bankers, and Hollywood executives who could afford to escape, the water became an exclusive sanctuary. This was the era of the high-speed commuter, the weekend estate, and the belief that brute mechanical force could conquer geography. In the summer of 1939, this culture reached its physical peak on the waters of Long Island Sound and the deep, unforgiving chop of the Great Lakes. Owners were not just using these boats for gentle sunset cruises. They were running them hard across open bays, pushing the massive engines to their thermal limits, and demanding that the heavy mahogany hulls act as reliable maritime limousines. The engineering difference was not theoretical, it was violently physical. On a rough, wind-torn afternoon on Long Island Sound, where a flatter, mass-produced hull would pound, throw spray, and force the throttles back to an idle, the heavy double-planked Gar Wood could keep speed, keep control, and keep the owner believing the boat was built to punish the water. The American response to this capability was absolute loyalty. When an owner experienced that ride, they did not go back to a lesser brand. Trade journals like Motorboating and Yachting consistently featured Gar Wood in their premier spreads, framing the boats not as mere recreational toys, but as essential tools for the American elite. The dealer in Alexandria Bay did not just sell a boat, he sold the capability to outrun a sudden St. Lawrence River thunderstorm. The dealer in Miami sold the ability to blast through the aggressive chop of Biscayne Bay without shattering the hull frames. By 1940, Gar Wood Boats had achieved its peak American operational presence. To see a 28-foot custom runabout tied to a dock in Lake George, at this time, was to witness the pinnacle of American maritime confidence. The sheer mass of the vessel, the flawless reflection of the sky and the varnished topsides, and the quiet authority of the cast bronze hardware communicated a total disregard for compromise. The owner, the mechanic, and the marina operator all understood the unspoken agreement. The vessel demanded everything, and in return, it delivered perfection. Industry estimates indicate that thousands of these premium hulls were in active service across the United States. The Algonac plant was running at full capacity, consuming millions of board feet of imported mahogany and thousands of gallons of marine varnish. The brand had successfully bridged the impossible gap between custom racing heritage and standardized luxury production. But this peak was built on a fragile economic foundation. The entire Gar Wood model depended on the existence of highly skilled, affordable American craftsmen to build the boats, and an army of cheap marina mechanics, varnishers, and boatyard workers to maintain them. The hull was beautiful, but it was incredibly labor-intensive. The engines were powerful, but they required constant, expert tuning. The wood was flawless, but it demanded an annual ritual of stripping, sanding, and sealing. In 1941, the United States entered the Second World War. The Algonac plant stopped building mahogany pleasure boats entirely. They shifted to military production, building target boats, aircraft rescue vessels, and utility tugs for the Navy and the Army. When the war ended in 1945, the factory prepared to resume its dominance of the American water. The brand name was still legendary. The national dealer network was desperate for inventory. The American public was armed with unprecedented savings and a profound desire to get back to the lakes, the bays, and the rivers. The stage was set for the greatest era of recreational boat building the country had ever seen. The factory gates opened. The workers returned. But the American market they were building for no longer existed. The decline of Gar Wood Boats in America was not caused by a failure of engineering. It was caused by a profound structural mutation in the American maritime economy. The country that emerged from the Second World War was not the country that had purchased custom luxury runabouts in 1935. The elite, exclusionary boating culture of the Great Depression had been permanently replaced by the aggressive, cost-conscious, mass-market reality of the post-war boom. When peacetime production resumed, the company attempted a massive expansion. They moved operations from the historic Algonac site to a sprawling modern facility in Marysville, Michigan. The executives anticipated a triumphant return to the luxury market. They had the name, they had the factory, they had the mahogany. But their survival was immediately compromised by three overwhelming American market forces arriving in sequence. The first blow was Force 1, domestic shipyard, dealer and fleet dominance. While Gar Wood had spent the pre-war years perfecting the heavy, expensive, custom-built runabout, their primary domestic rival, Chris-Craft, had spent the war mastering true industrial scale. Operating just miles away in Michigan, Chris-Craft had utilized the wartime production mandates to optimize their assembly lines to a terrifying degree. When the war ended, Chris-Craft did not target the remaining Wall Street bankers. They targeted the returning American middle class. Chris-Craft flooded the American market with smaller, lighter, vastly cheaper utility boats and runabouts. They signed aggressive dealer agreements across the country, capturing marinas on inland lakes, coastal bays, and riverfronts before Gar Wood could reestablish its network. In 1946, an American buyer could walk into a marine dealership and purchase a mass-produced 17-foot Chris-Craft runabout for roughly $1,800. A comparable Gar Wood, burdened by its relentless commitment to hand-fitted craftsmanship, cost significantly more to produce and required a higher retail price to survive. In the new economy, prestige was no longer enough to overcome a massive price disadvantage. The American dealer network, the lifeblood of any maritime manufacturer, began to shift its floor space to the brands that could deliver high volume, rapid inventory turnover, and lower consumer friction. Simultaneously, the Marysville factory was hit by Force 4, technological disruption. The Second World War had fundamentally changed how boats could be built. The military had demanded lightweight, high-speed vessels, leading to the perfection of marine-grade plywood and synthetic resin glues. Marine plywood, thin sheets of wood laminated together with waterproof adhesives, allowed a competitor to build a hull in a fraction of the time it took to construct a traditional, solid plank boat. A plywood boat was lighter. It required fewer specialized shipwrights. It required a fraction of the heavy bronze fasteners. Gar Wood refused to abandon its heritage. The company continued to insist on the labor-intensive, double-planked mahogany bottom. They continued to bolt their frames rather than simply screw them. They continued to build hulls designed to last 50 years for a post-war consumer market that only wanted a boat for the upcoming weekend. The technological disruption was not just about materials, it was about the velocity of production. The Marysville plant was building 19th century artisan quality inside a 20th century industrial economy. The math could not be reconciled, but the final fatal pressure came from Force 5. Maintenance, fuel, marina, crew, and infrastructure costs. The pre-war Gar Wood business model was entirely dependent on the existence of cheap, highly skilled American labor. In 1935, a wealthy owner could easily hire a local marina worker for a few dollars a week to sand, varnish, and tune his runabout. By 1946, the American labor market had transformed. The United States was heavily unionized. Wages had skyrocketed. The skilled woodworkers, varnishers, and marine mechanics who had survived the war were no longer willing to work for Depression-era wages. The cost to maintain a massive, highly varnished wooden boat exploded. A deep V hull covered in 15 coats of spar varnish required hundreds of hours of manual labor to prepare for the spring launch. The marine engines, with their dual carburetors and complex ignition systems, demanded expensive, specialized mechanics. The new American boater did not want a vessel that required a payroll to maintain. They wanted a boat they could pull behind a station wagon on a steel trailer. They wanted a boat they could leave tied to an exposed dock without worrying about ultraviolet light destroying the varnish. They wanted a boat that started with the turn of a key and required nothing more than an occasional oil change. The Gar Wood runabout was structurally incompatible with this new version of American leisure. The boats were too heavy to be easily trailered by the automobiles of the period. They were too highly finished to be left uncovered. They were too complex for the average owner to repair. The turning point arrived in the winter of 1946. The Marysville plant was struggling to hit its production quotas. The supply chain for high-grade Philippine mahogany was severely disrupted, driving raw material costs to unsustainable levels. The national dealer network, sensing the shifting winds of the market, began canceling their advance orders. The Miami dealerships asked for cheaper utility models. The Lake Tahoe operators kept the old boats running, but hesitated to buy new ones at the inflated post-war prices. The New York showrooms, once the epicenter of the brand's power, found that their wealthy clients were moving away from heavy speedboats and turning their attention to offshore sailing yachts or the emerging aviation market. The brand was being squeezed out of the very harbors it had once defined. By the early months of 1947, the retreat across the American maritime landscape accelerated into a collapse. The brand that had once dictated the standard of luxury to the United States market was now being systematically erased from the nation's premier waterways. The withdrawal did not happen in the press. It happened on the showroom floors and at the marina fuel docks. The exclusive dealer network, which had taken 2 decades to construct, began to fracture. Fitzgerald and Lee in Alexandria Bay, long a stronghold for massive mahogany runabouts, found that their wealthy clientele in the Thousand Islands were increasingly hesitant to commission heavy, expensive inboard boats. On the West Coast, the Seattle Yacht Club saw fewer new Gar Wood deliveries arriving by rail. Dealerships in Florida, previously eager for the deep V offshore hulls that could handle the Atlantic chop, shifted their floor financing to lighter, faster-turning inventory. Marina owners faced a brutal economic choice. They could dedicate their limited slip space and showroom capacity to a single Gar Wood that might take a year to sell, or they could fill that same space with 5 mass-produced boats that would sell in a month. The competitive displacement was swift and overwhelming. Chris Craft did not just undercut the Marysville factory on price, they actively outmaneuvered them in dealer contracts. Chris Craft utilized exclusive franchise agreements, often requiring a marina to drop competing inboard lines if they wanted access to the highly lucrative, high-volume Chris Craft catalog. At the same time, the Century Boat Company of Manistee, Michigan, launched a relentless assault on the premium utility segment. A vessel like the Century Seamaid offered high-speed mahogany styling with reliable automotive-based marine engines, but it was built using more efficient production techniques. In 1947, an American buyer could purchase a highly finished 17-foot Century or Chris Craft runabout for under $2,500, roughly $35,000 today. A comparable model from Gar Wood required an expenditure pushing past $4,000. Furthermore, a new mechanical threat was emerging on the transom. The post-war marine market saw the rapid advancement of the high-horsepower outboard engine, an engine mounted outside the transom that combines the powerhead, gear case, and propeller in one removable unit. Brands like Evinrude and Johnson were beginning to offer reliable, powerful outboards that allowed a consumer to buy a cheap, empty plywood hull and simply clamp the propulsion system onto the back. If the engine broke, the owner did not need to hire a specialized shipyard mechanic or schedule a massive haul-out. They simply unbolted the motor and drove it to a repair shop in the trunk of their car. Against this logistical convenience, the heavy inboard-powered Gar Wood runabout became an anachronism. The boats required specialized infrastructure. They needed heavy-duty marine travel lifts to be removed from the water. They needed mechanics trained to align solid bronze propeller shafts to a tolerance of thousandths of an inch. They required massive boathouses to protect their delicate finishes from the weather. In the rapidly suburbanizing United States of 1947, where leisure time was measured in weekend trailer trips rather than 3-month estate vacations, that infrastructure was disappearing. The corporate leadership at the Marysville plant looked at the ledgers in the spring of 1947. Garfield Wood himself had largely stepped away from active management, leaving a corporate board to face the undeniable mathematics of the post-war economy. The cost of raw, imported Philippine mahogany had spiked. The supply chains for heavy bronze castings were unreliable. The unionized labor force demanded wages that made the double-planked hull an economic impossibility. The company tried to pivot, briefly experimenting with a few fiberglass prototypes and cheaper plywood designs, but they lacked the capital, the industrial agility, and the cultural willingness to abandon their heritage of heavy craftsmanship. To scale down the quality would destroy the name. To maintain the quality would bankrupt the company. The final American chapter arrived in the spring of 1947. The board made the decision. The Marysville plant canceled all pending boat orders. The massive factory doors closed. The boat building division was liquidated entirely. Hundreds of specialized woodworkers lost their jobs. The vast reserves of imported mahogany were sold to competitors. The heavy bronze deck hardware was sold for industrial scrap. The remaining dealer network collapsed. The authorized service centers lost their factory support. The marina mechanics had to fabricate their own replacement parts. The factory tooling was dismantled. The production lines went completely quiet. The empty hulls sat unfinished. The workers walked away. The water belonged to others. The silence at the Marysville plant in 1947 was absolute, but the name on the builder's plate refused to completely disappear. Unlike many fallen maritime empires that were absorbed by conglomerates and hollowed out into cheap decals, the Gar Wood brand experienced a rare, genuine American resurrection. Decades after the factory doors closed and the original tooling was scrapped, the Turcotte family in upstate New York acquired the rights to the Gar Wood name and the original factory blueprints. Operating out of a small, highly specialized boatyard in the Adirondacks, they began building new Gar Wood custom runabouts. They used the same structural dimensions, the same heavy mahogany, and the same visual presence, but bonded them with modern marine epoxies, advanced structural adhesives that permanently seal the wood and prevent water intrusion, to solve the grueling maintenance nightmare that had doomed the original company. The brand survived not as a mass-market competitor, but by returning to exactly what Garfield Wood had originally envisioned: a low-volume, ultra-premium builder of custom mechanical art. But for a fierce, dedicated community of American maritime enthusiasts, the new builds are not enough. They want the original Algonac and Marysville hulls. Today, an entire secondary economy exists purely to keep the surviving pre-war Gar Wood boats alive. The Antique and Classic Boat Society, vintage boat restoration yards across the Great Lakes, and highly specialized marine mechanics in New England treat these vessels with a reverence usually reserved for historic architecture. At events like the Lake Tahoe Concours d'Elegance or the massive antique boat shows in Clayton, New York, a perfectly restored 28-foot Gar Wood runabout is the undisputed center of gravity. Collectors, maritime museums, and private families now pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes pushing past $500,000 for rare twin-engine commuters, to acquire and restore boats that the American market discarded as obsolete and too expensive to maintain in 1947. They hire specialized shipwrights. They source correct period-accurate Chrysler Imperial Marine engines. They track down original cast bronze deck hardware as if recovering lost gold. They pay these astronomical sums because a heavy, double-planked wooden runabout, properly maintained, can still cross a rough American lake in a way that modern fiberglass simply cannot imitate. It is not about fuel efficiency. It is not about ultimate top speed. It is about mass, momentum, and acoustic resonance. When an original Gar Wood hits a heavy wake at 40 miles per hour on Lake George, the wooden hull does not shudder with a hollow plastic echo. It absorbs the impact with a deep, solid thud that travels up through the heavy internal frames, through the leather seats, and directly into the driver's hands. The smell of hot engine oil mixing with marine spar varnish, the mechanical whine of the direct drive transmission, and the sight of a long mahogany deck parting the water belong to a specific kind of American leisure that was built for the senses, not for convenience. It is a physical, demanding relationship between the captain, the mechanic, and the water that a maintenance-free modern boat deliberately erases. If you visit the physical sites of this fallen empire today, the maritime context that birthed these machines has been completely paved over. In Marysville, Michigan, the sprawling industrial footprint where the final Gar Wood boats were canceled is now occupied by municipal infrastructure, commercial businesses, and modern waterfront parks along the edge of the St. Clair River. In Algonac, where the legend began, historical markers acknowledge the past, but the massive timber sheds, the heavy launch ramps, and the deafening roar of surplus aircraft engines being tested on the water are gone forever. The local infrastructure that supported an army of American woodworkers, varnishers, and marine mechanics has been replaced by the quiet, efficient logistics of modern manufacturing and suburban development. The river still flows past the Michigan banks, but the empire that commanded it has vanished into the soil. Yet there is a quiet, surprising footnote to the Gar Wood collapse. On the deep, cold, high-altitude waters of Lake Tahoe, there are original Gar Wood runabouts that were delivered by rail to California in the 1930s that have never left the lake. Incredibly, some have never left the American families that originally bought them. Passed down through 4 generations, these specific boats outlived the factory that built them, outlived the competitors that destroyed the brand, and outlived the era of cheap fiberglass that was supposed to make them obsolete. They survived because one family decided that the grueling annual maintenance was not a burden, but a necessary ritual of ownership. The American story of Gar Wood Boats reveals the brutal gap between what the boating public says it values and what it actually buys. We romanticize craftsmanship, obsessive engineering, and flawless physical beauty. We admire the shipwright and praise the varnished hull. But when forced to choose at the dealership, the American market inevitably votes for financing, lower maintenance, logistical convenience, and massive scale. The United States demands that its maritime excellence be cheap to own and easy to ignore. When a water culture built on seasonal repair, deep local knowledge, and absolute mechanical respect was replaced by fiberglass molds and turnkey convenience, boating became accessible to millions, but it lost its gravity. But somewhere on a quiet Michigan lake, just before dawn, a double-planked mahogany hull still sits in a dark, wooden boathouse, the heavy bronze cleats cold to the touch, the varnish reflecting the rising sun, still waiting for the heavy brass throttle to fall and the water to break. See you in the next one.